Thanks, Tom. The title of this paper is Citizenship as New Identity Conversion in the Letter to Philippians. I will just be focusing on a little piece of 1 Philippians 27 to 30. So the thesis was just too complex to put into a 30-minute kind of as most of you would know who've done a thesis, it's just a bit too much. And so I thought I'd just narrow it right down, and I'll just read from my paper. I chose to study conversion in Philippians because the concept of citizenship, as explicit in the letter to the Philippians, has been, to my knowledge, never been explored as a motive of conversion. I define conversion not so much in the thesis and not so much in theological terms, but in the acquisition of a new social identity, which had a worldview, a new worldview, values and behaviours associated with it. My project was a social scientific study of conversion rather than a theological study. The theoretical framework that I used to show how Paul used citizenship terminology in Philippians, as they would understand it to be an act of conversion, was social identity theory, which I'll talk about in a moment, because you won't understand my version or my exegesis of 1 Philippians 27 to 30 without some understanding of social identity theory, and it's what belongs to it. The use of citizenship language in Philippians was significant because the social and political obligations demanded by citizenship would require the Philippian converts to acquire a new worldview and have values and behaviours that were consistent with that new worldview. Citizenship in the first century, as it is now, had political and social significance, though for an individual to have citizenship in Paul's time was much rarer than it is today. The possession of citizenship, especially Roman, gave a person certain rights and a greater honour than those who did not possess it. It also required the exhibition of behaviours that showed an allegiance to Caesar as Lord. My research was applied to several sections of the Philippians correspondence. However, in this paper I'll focus on how social identity theory applied to Philippians 1:27 to 30. Before we get there, I'll just go through social identity theory. So this is a bit thick here. So there was a lot of jargon and some concepts, but I hope I've done justice. Social identity theory is the product of Henri Tachfeld and his experiences being a World War II prisoner and the war's aftermath. His research on intergroup comparisons is connected with the social psychology of human groups in conflict. The results of his early research experiments found that humans, when organised anonymously and randomly into groups, developed categories that were discriminatory and in favour of the group that they were organised into. The basis of social identity theory is that individuals are members of numerous social groups, and that these groups will be perceived as giving them either a positive or negative self-image. Because individuals strive for a positive self-image, they categorise and evaluate their social groups, ordering them into a hierarchical fashion. This is the process of social categorisation which enables an individual to simplify his or her social context. It can be understood as the ordering of the social environment in terms of groupings of persons in a manner which makes sense to the individual. Social identity theory argues that an individual is categorised as belonging to a group when the individual themselves acknowledge that they have belonged to a social group. The individual evaluates their membership in that it's either a positive or negative impact on their identity. These evaluations act as a guide at the cognitive level and help the individual to judge and evaluate the differences between social groups. Another component is the emotional aspect, whereby when an individual attaches emotional significance to membership in that group or groups that affects an individual's attitude towards both the in-group and to others who are in out-groups. So us and them, in-group is us, out-group is them. Thus forming a social identity. Tajfeld found that the above aspects were found in every group, regardless of their ethnicity, size, or number of categories. The differentiation of groups perceived by an individual, whether by linguistic or ethnic markers, aims to maintain and preserve the distinctiveness of their characteristics and identity. Tajfeld recognised that many different social groups were at the same time both separated and at the same time unavoidably shackled together, and that the survival of each group depended on the nature of their relations. Because social identity theory could be used in a setting where is multicultural, I argue that the theory was an appropriate framework that would demonstrate how Paul used the category, status, of citizenship as having a positive image for an individual, thus making it more attractive for someone to become a church member. In order to give membership in a particular social group a positive image, Tajfeld argues intergroup conflict will enable an individual to distinguish between in-group and out-group. Where there is intergroup conflict, particularly groups attempting to establish its distinctiveness, this often occurs in societies where there are several different ethnic groups that are trying to maintain ethnic distinction. Tajfeld found that greater emotional emphasis is placed on the differences between languages, anthems, sporting teams, and anything that conserves or differentiates their cultural social system from others. The behavioural and psychological distinctiveness is formed whereby the worth of groups and individuals is in a clear cut and inflexible as possible. The result is a clear establishment of social identity. So for Paul's converse, being a citizen would have clear-cut lines of distinction. Social identity theory is primarily concerned with intergroup discrimination and conflict between individuals and groups. Both individuals and groups seek to differentiate themselves in order to maintain a positive image from others that they perceive as not providing a positive social identity. John Turner, one of Tajfeld's doctoral students, expanded as to SIT, or social identity theory, by describing an intra-group process he called self-categorisation theory. Turner seeks explanations as to why individuals would perceive and define themselves and act as a single unit. His explanation focuses on the process that takes place inside groups between what he calls subgroups and a superordinate group. Self-categorisation theory highlights the fact that not only do people belong to different groups, but also that different groups hold varying levels of importance to one's self-identity, also a concept. Self-identity or self-concept is operational at three levels. So the superordinate level, that is the self-categorisation of one's identity as shared with others. So at the highest level we would say we're humans. That would be a group we would say we belong to, humanity. Okay. The other level is the intermediate level group. This is the in and out group social level based on similarities and differences. So that would be working class, elite, black, white, male, female, kind of thing. The subordinate level is personal, whereby a person self-categorises herself or himself as an individual and highlights the differences with other in-group members. Thus, these categories define an individual's human, social, and personal identity based on intra-group comparisons between individuals and others. The varying levels of importance to one's self-identity or self-concept can be activated by different social conditions. The different social conditions will make one aspect of identity more what we call salient. The term salient or salience refers to the self-defining or social categorisation of an individual or group that become prominent depending on the social conditions. An example of this can be seen in 1 Corinthians 5, where Paul commends the church at Corinth to expel the pornos, or the man who's sleeping with his stepmother. self-categorization theory's approach would be suggest that it is possible that some Christians at Corinth will do nothing about this man because he's a rich patron at the church at Corinth, whom they don't want to dishonour. Thus, they consider being his client as more salient to their social identity than perceiving that they belong to a superordinate group called the church, or the ecclesia at Corinth, of which Paul is the apostle. In such an analysis, the Corinthians see themselves as a group who identify as clients of the man who should be expelled, and membership in a group that is salient for the individual acts as a guide to both individual and group behaviour. Last bit of social identity theory. I know it is a bit thick, but it's part of the thesis. Another aspect of social identity theory determines the applicability for the study of conversion in the New Testament is the notion of common group identity. The common group identity gives an explanation as to how a socially and ethnically diverse group can not only come together in the first place, but also remain together. In socially and ethnically diverse contexts, the presence of groups and individuals with pre-existing social identities that have salience for these groups coexist. Intergroup comparisons that involve group salient identity would normally be at odds with the formation of a new socio-political group identity. The common group identity model offers a possible explanation as to how identity can be constructed amongst those who come from a diverse cultural background. It reduces intergroup bias by showing how those previously perceived as out-group members can become in-group ones by changing the perception of the us and them to a more inclusive we. This is done by increasing the salience of the existing common superordinate group, a process known as recategorization. Gardner et al. Note that recategorization of the in-group does not eliminate categories, rather it reduces previous intergroup and bias and conflict. If members of different groups are induced to conceive of themselves as a single group rather than two completely separate groups, attitude towards former outmembers will become more positive through the process involving pro-in-group bias. By recategorizing the boundary markers that define membership in the church, there is a reduction of bias and an increase of positive attitudes towards former out-group members in a stereotyped fashion. Thus, in creating a new superordinate group, the psychological and cognitive distance between in-group members and the self diminishes, while the distance between the self and non-group members changes little. I argued in my thesis that citizenship was a way of recategorization for Paul's converts. In other words, if a convert perceived himself or herself as a citizen, they saw other converts as a citizen of heaven, then there would be a reduction in social bias towards other converts from different backgrounds because they have a heavenly citizenship that's in common. The creation of a new common citizenship held by the Philippian believers created a new superordinate group from separate subordinate groups from which the converts had come and gave them equal status. This means that the psychological distance is less between those who are members of a new in-group than those who belong to an out-group. This is due to a fact that there is a tendency to attribute positive behaviour to in-group members rather than to out-group members. Persons who were once two distinct groups now can conceive themselves as being part of one group and exhibit positive emotional and behavioural personal behaviours to others. It is not based on the activities of the group, but based on the recognition that they are one group. So that is, I know, a lot to swallow. And if you're not familiar with social identity theory, I'm sorry, but it's what I used. So now to the text itself. In order to unify the Philippians into a superordinate group, Paul used a concept that would be viewed as having greater salience than the other previous social identities or their subgroups. In my thesis, I argue that Paul used the notion of citizenship, citizenship of heaven, which is found in chapter 1, verses 27 to 30, and 3:20 as well. But I don't cover that here, as the basis for his convert's new identity and status. We have up here, I just have verses 27 to 30. In verses 27 to 30, they form a discrete unit that constitutes a change of subject matter in Paul's move from his own circumstances in verses 18 to 26 to that of his converts. The main verb in the unit used is the imperative poly tu este, which is an exhortation to govern their lives as converts. So it's, we have up there, only live your life in a worthily manner, in a manner worthily. It would probably really render a bit more literally as only act as worthy citizens. That doesn't make sense to us as such now. It wouldn't make sense if you wrote that down and people would be thinking, what are you talking about? So I think, I'm not necessarily trying to criticise other translations, but you do miss the political significance, because this puts this into a moral, kind of a more moral aspect, rather that there's here, I think Paul's talking about something wider than just morals as such. Rather than just exhorting his converts to a new code of ethics, he wanted them to act from a position of perceiving themselves as citizens, thus having a common group identity. This included a worldview that impacted their social identity, because now they had a higher allegiance to the Messiah rather than to Caesar. I argued in my thesis that Paul built on the fact that Roman citizenship could provide a positive self-image by reminding the converts that they were citizens of a new society, one with a worldview and values different from the Roman-dominated ones at Philippi, and would that influence the groups that they'd come from. The exhortation for his converts to act worthily, to act as worthy citizens of the gospel of Christ, is a call for all of them to exercise their citizenship in public life and space in the colony of Philippi. The basis of the exhortation is that they already possess citizenship. Gordon Fee correctly connects verse 27a to Philippians 3, 17 to 20 in his rendering, live in the Roman colony of Philippi as worthy citizens of your heavenly homeland. The political language was used to encourage the salient identity of citizenship in his converts as they responded to those who were causing their suffering. It is, therefore, also a comparison between two different socio-political groups. Paul was referring to two different behaviours exhibited by two different groups of citizens. The Philippians are his in-group, who have had a new perception of reality, compared to the Roman citizens of Philippi. Paul did not want them to want the new status as citizens to be misconstrued by his converts, in that they would start to mimic behaviour of the elites. So, as you can see especially in verses 28 to 30, you see that the converts, as they were living out the gospel at Philippi, they were suffering opposition to that. The recategorisation of the Philippians as citizens was intended to enable a new social identity to be formed as they propagated the gospel. The new citizenship, however, caused opposition from the wider culture as they interacted in the public arena. In the Greco-Roman world, those who held citizenship were expected to act as one group and to stand fast in a common purpose. As citizens of heaven, of the heavenly commonwealth, they were to stand fast together in the face of opposition, as would be expected of citizens. Timothy Jeffreyon argues that the converts would have understood as as a call to loyalty. Standing firm would be expected as a civil duty of citizens against their opposition or their opponents, especially those of a colony with a strong military history and political connections as Philippi. Thus, it is not unreasonable nor unexpected that a military metaphor has been used alongside of citizenship, as the Roman army was made up from Roman citizens. Paul needed to address the immediate problem of suffering experienced by his converts as they engaged in the propagation of the gospel in the public context. They were to respond by being unified in concord with one another. They were to stand firm in one spirit, one mind, which is a theme throughout the letter, because this would reinforce the identity of the converts as a body of citizens. As Roman citizens were expected to act in the interest of Rome, likewise the Philippians were to act in the interest of the heavenly commonwealth, or more importantly, its Messiah. Furthermore, Paul establishes the us boundaries of the superordinate group in the political motif of citizenship. He wanted the Philippians to continue spreading the gospel in the public sphere in the midst of the Philippians, of Philippi, and they were to continue to struggle alongside one another as they stood firm. The use of political terms would also reinforce the significance of the converts community as more than simply a voluntary association or a koinonia, but a new civic community of citizens. If this fledgling civic community is to survive, then it must be united and require allegiance from its members. Furthermore, for Paul, it is important that the Philippians stay united by maintaining their common group identity and common aim. Because Paul identified his converts as citizens of heaven, he could make a contrast between their values and the Roman worldview that Caesar was Lord at Philippi. Standing united against a common opponent would also strengthen the Philippians' psychological bonds and reduce bias between members of the subgroups within the church. An individual would perceive himself or herself as sharing a common group identity and having a superordinate identity as a citizen. Calling his converts citizens, Paul categorises them in his mind as his favourite in-group. It also gave a positive appraisal of his converts that enabled them to have a positive evaluation of themselves as a group, as strange as that sounds, persecution. Thus, the converts could self-categorise in a positive way, even though they had opposition. It would also encourage loyalty to the group. The positive value of being called a citizen would be specifically or especially salient for those in the group who had never possessed any status, rights or privileges of citizenship. Paul's positive evaluation of his in-group encouraged them not to be intimidated by their opponents. In verse 28, he used the rhetoric of consolation in order to stir his converts from any despondency that they might be experiencing. Due to Paul's or either their own ordeal, Paul Holloway identifies the key features of how Paul achieved this. First, being unified and steadfast in the face of opposition will result in their salvation and the destruction of their opponents. Second, their suffering is divinely ordained. In verse 29, it says, "For he has graciously granted that you would suffer." If you found it, verse 29. Not only the privilege, you're the privilege not only of believing in Christ, but for suffering for him as well. Not a popular concept. Third, they share in the same suffering as Paul, who suffered for his service to the Messiah. Though the converts belonged to the sociopolitical context of Philippi, they were also a part of a new civic community that had an alternative worldview. Thus, the experiencing of opposition and suffering was also evidence that they were already seen as having allegiance to a new patron who was above Caesar. The issue for Paul's converts was one of suffering due to conflict with their new citizenship and their old allegiances to previous socio-political groups. These previous socio-political groups would have been seen in what social identity calls as superordinate. So the groups that they did belong to were classed as superordinate. Now they become subordinate, of course, and citizenship replaces them. I lost my way in that. Paul's language suggests that the opponents were from the immediate context of Philippi, because there is no mention of outsiders coming to the city causing an ordeal. Verse 30 indicates that the Philippians were going through a problem similar to that which Paul was facing, one that involved conflict with Roman authorities. The Philippians would have membership in social and political groups and various subgroups that were once salient to their previous identity. So that would include not only family groups, but it could include groups, associations, or cults, religious groups that were once part of. In living out the gospel, it would seem that they were now acting in ways considered to be subversive to Roman customs and other socio-political groups that were once salient to them. It is quite likely that the converts' behaviour was seen by the Romans as subversive to the well-being of the city. For instance, if the converts had withdrawn from participation in civic assemblies, expressing allegiance and devotion to civic and Roman gods, and the public honouring of Caesar as Lord, then there is the possibility of social exclusion. There could also have been the possibility of economic marginalisation in the various subgroups that, such as volunteer associations to which they belonged. If converts were to withdraw from offerings in honour and worship to the association's gods, then this would be seen as an offering offending the association's patron god. The notion of acting as a worthy citizen also carries with it political and military connotations of a citizen's obligation and allegiance in the face of suffering. It is likely that Paul perceived his ill treatment by the Roman authorities at Philippi in Acts 16 as akin to the suffering faced by his converts, whose loyalty is now being brought into question by the dominant Roman culture. His use of political terminology suggests that his converts knew that being part of a citizen entailed remaining loyal to one's allegiances even in the face of suffering. Suffering for the gospel, therefore, was recategorised by Paul as a positive example of citizenship. This would strengthen, as I've mentioned before, the psychological bonds among the converts, with the hope that they would act as a united group and in remaining loyal to their Messiah. Those standing firm would regard themselves as he would regard them as having made his worldview and values salient to their identity, and it is highly probable that gospel was perceived as suspect, in that those who were in the church now considered their ruler and saviour above Caesar as Jesus Christ. However, Paul's confidence in the portrayal that his God and the gospel will be victorious had turned suffering and opposition into a positive one for him, well, not a positive experience, but to give a positive self-image to his converts. More than once he reminded his converts to have confidence that divine agency was working among them and that they were being made ready for the day of Christ. Thus, salvation is not just trust in the Messiah, but also the sharing in the sufferings that were brought about by living a life in accordance with the gospel. Just in concluding remarks, many of us understand conversion as a transformation of the heart, which I do not disagree with, but the definition is heavily influenced by our own readings of Paul and by the Gospels, and from other parts of Paul's letters. In Philippians, conversion is more connected as to having a new status that comes from having a new loyalty and worldview when a person comes to faith in Christ. It is also connected to living out the gospel in public life. A person's citizenship is not a hidden status or free of obligations. I think that Paul expected his converts to live out the proclamation of the gospel in the public arena and in the public, in society in general. That was enough. Sorry. Yeah, any questions?
Damian, thank you very much indeed. You were talking about the converts, and you're talking about the new citizenship, forming of the new disciples. Was your sense that this was an open group or a closed group, or was there a tension there?
I would suggest there's a tension. I think particularly here, when you see there's opposition, there's a tendency for groups to close a little. And I guess my focus was on how identity formation while that was happening. I was sort of creating an identity for them, reminding them of it. I think they would have to be open.
To get new people, you'd be open. A bit.
We have to be. I think, and living out the gospel in public life would suggest that. But I think what I'm saying here is that this is, I guess, identity formation that Paul is doing with new citizenship. So that someone would come in and they would, I guess, the idea being they would have the status as a citizen of heaven. But there's that expectation that as a citizen, you would have new obligations, new loyalty, not so much to Caesar or to even other groups, but your primary loyalty is to the Messiah. One of the things I learned was, one of the things this social identity theory points out is you can still belong to a number of groups even though you might belong to the ecclesia. So it's in a way, citizenship is an acquisition of a new social identity that was meant to have a high priority, or the highest priority. I hope that answers something.
Thank you.
Could I just unpack this a little bit? It seems to me, and thank you for this concept of citizenship, and I hadn't put it in this, but to be a citizen implies that we are citizens of a group, and therefore we have responsibilities about how our living in relation to our Lord, but also to each other. And I think we now often read this as a very individual, so you, singular, live your life in a manner worthy because you are a citizen. But it seems to me that we have that challenge of identifying what are the characteristics of citizenship within our group, because I think a lot of our tensions and sufferings are actually within the citizenship group, and not so much with those who are not citizens of this. So while our opposition, there is some opposition in, I'll say, the world, but for us, a lot of this division is, we go, okay, well, we all maintain Jesus is Lord, and then how we live under that at the moment is under a lot of redefinition. So it's quite, I don't think we are really united. We find it hard to be all part of that one citizenship group, actually.
And I think the same is still they probably have the same similar problems in a sense. Philippi in particular had a lot of, while it was Roman dominated, it still had its cults from centuries before. So the horse cult and a few other.
And they would all be brought into this
they're still active.
to sort of find that out.
Yeah. So most likely the people at the church at Philippi were in high status. Most likely. They might have had some, but you've got such a mix of people that trying to even bring, I think Paul was trying to use that notion of citizenship, which they would have understood to some degree, even though they didn't possess it, to try and kind of not smooth over the other things, but to make it more important. But yes, you have to figure out, well, what does that actually mean? And I think in his context, in Paul's, and in the Philippians context, it was mostly about loyalty, and a large imperial cult as well.
Unless I misheard you, early on, when you were talking about social inclusion theory, you said individuals...
Social identity theory?
Yeah. Individuals could get either positive or negative benefits. Did you say that?
No. So a negative self-image.
Right. So you would belong to a group which would give you negative self-image.
Yeah,
could you give me an example of that?
No, you would evaluate whether this group you belong to gave you a positive one or a negative one.
Against what? Against society in general?
Well,
or bikies?
Well, if you say, say you've got two different groups, you just bring it down to two different groups. Or you might have 5 different groups.
Yes.
You'll evaluate them from best to worst. So what they found was, the social identity theory was, people would tend to join a group that would give them a positive identity. So you can only do that. You can only compare or know whether one group is giving you a more positive identity or one that's not by having a comparison.
Oh, I see. So you're saying for the individual, there are groups which are higher up than lower up.
Yeah.
Okay, so for bikies, for instance, being a bikie is the highest,
Yes.
even though for society in general.
But society in
I
general,
get it,
that's
I get it, I get it.
So it's a comparison. You can only do it by comparing.
Yes. Within
And
terms
what
of the
is that for you?
individual.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, I think the government tends to sort of put being Australian as a superordinate group, but actually, as Christians, being Christian is above being Australian. But on the other hand, you also have to be inclusive, and if you love your neighbour, you love your Muslims and atheists and Buddhists and Jews and everyone else as well. But this can be a bit of a problem in our society, but too much nationalism is dangerous, I think.
Yeah, well, we're having, even with Australian citizenship, recently with the politicians who, some of them were born here, but I think they wanted their parents to have. Is that the case? Was some born here? Or yeah, and so the whole idea of who's an Australian citizen is kind of under, not question, but it's in question recently.
Sorry, can I ask another one? I'm
Yeah.
very interested in the phrase, intimidated by your opponents, and yet we are to live a life worthy of the gospel of Christ. So if Christ is the highest common feature, and the destruction of the opponents, what did you discover that's all about when you were looking at this community?
Yeah, because with social identity theory, I didn't really go into depth as such with that.
Yeah.
It was more that was, in some way Paul was saying, you're kind of on the right team, and the sign of that will be your opponent's destruction. So it's not, so essentially look at me like I said something wrong.
No. I'm just wondering what you discovered when you looked at the passage through this.
No, that one-
through the lens of this theory. Because
Well, yeah. So I guess it's really about intergroup clashing. I guess you could say you have
Yes,
opponents and you have.
So what do I do as I'm loyal to Christ?
That you remain loyal to the gospel. That's what, and living out the gospel. And in some sense, it's almost like there's a passive of, well, God will sort out your opponents, and their end will be destruction.
It's good to know they had the tension too.
Yeah.
What are the comparisons then with Roman military or Roman political ideology in that sort of a line of argumentation? Because it seems to me that you're saying that Paul is taking a political stance, saying you are now part of a new political body, you're citizens of a new nation, a new kingdom, and God is going to destroy your enemies, effectively speaking.
Yeah.
How does that compare, and I'm not sure if your research necessarily covered it, but then how does that compare to the rhetoric of, say, the Roman Empire, which then says you're part of the Roman Empire, it is a privilege to die for Rome, or in this case, it seems like you're saying it's a privilege to suffer for Christ, or
Yeah,
is there a comparison there?
Don't know.
Okay.
That's right.
I think just picking up Mary's point, and in the way, translations influence our thinking. Only live your life in a manner, life singular. The verbs through there, I think, all plural.
Yeah.
Yes.
And just picking up Anthony's point, it strikes me that there are quite a few military metaphors through here as well. So striving side by side, plural, striving, that's I think probably a Roman military.
It is. The Philippi actually continued even in Paul's time to supply the military, because it was just full of veterans from.
So this was language they understood.
Yep, and for most of Roman history, you had to be a citizen to actually serve in the army. Not all of that.
We lived for a long time in Nepal, and there Christians could not enlist in the army because they couldn't give devotion to the gods in the beginning of the day, every day. That was a requirement. So either you said, oh, well, okay, I will, or you stood and said, well, no, I won't. And therefore you would never be. And it was a good earning place to be. So people, the young men, would strive to be in the army, but Christians would not because they couldn't stand.
Sorry, Kathy, because
Thanks, Damian. I find this social identity theory quite fascinating. It's the first time I've really thought about it, or I had it in contact with it. I wonder if there's an application today of social identity theory in terms of our own church membership and also in terms of missiology more generally. Is it possible that we are not able as a church to offer people the strong social identity that people look for when they come, when they begin to join a group? I realise it's not part of your research, but it's just a kind of a possibility of application.
I think in some ways, if I think of like some of the certainly more, and sometimes like some conservative churches actually grow, and I think because they do offer that more, I guess, stable identities, especially runs, I guess, that offer certain, this is a set role for a person in life, and they offer a more stable. So I think it does kind of work, but we're kind of in a very fluid time.
And clear social differentiation.
Yeah.
There is some research that supports that.
And so we don't have that. I think, well, it's hard to put it across denominations as well. So, because I belong to a very conservative Pentecostal denomination, well, there's others that are fairly not liberal, but
yeah, it's very interesting to listen to Santosh today. He would have had difficulty using this language of military because he come from in India. They're always talking about dialogue and living with people through and expressing mental witnessing in a pluralistic multi-religious society, and this language may be difficult for them, us and them and our citizenship being so exclusive sort of.
in some ways, yes. It was, Roman citizenship was much more inclusive than Greek, because Greek was more kin-based. You couldn't really get in unless you were kin as such. But Roman citizenship was more inclusive. It was more about having, well, one of them was to have allegiance with Rome, so it's more about loyalties to Rome. So I'm not sure if, the problem with Paul is, I remember someone said he's like an octopus in a jar. His tentacles going everywhere. He's very complex, and I don't really know if he would want a lot of clashing over it. But I guess he uses a metaphor that almost could, bring a lot of clashing, a lot of, if you're trying to build a tolerant society or society where people get along together, that's multicultural.
I just wanted to ask you, in the lens of the social identity theory, was that adequate in your research? Did you find any weaknesses in the social identity theory for the purpose for which you were using it? Was it insufficient or sufficient, or?
For what we could do in social identity theory, I thought it was basically sufficient. One of the weaknesses is social identity theory tends to be social experiments that are very closed, and based on modern people. So any social scientific study in the New Testament or Old Testament, for that matter, we're using modern concepts to describe ancient people. And so that's always something that sits there that you have to, I guess, have as attention. So that, they're not, so it tends to be, that was, I think, the main one.
So you have to be careful about being anachronistic.
Yeah. So, you sort of just, I guess, what I tried to do was conversion, say this is what I think, be a bit more defensive, I guess, in my thesis, but still make my point. Last one, please.
I'll try to make it a quick question then. In your research, did you come across SIT research with respect to military groups and soldiers? Because I feel like that might have some application there.
I dare say there would be. I mean, I'm not totally across SIT. There would be. There's a lot of the focus of SIT now is on nationalism.
Okay.
but that will include military and patriotism, that kind of thing. So, yes, so that, one of the reasons, and I guess as I said, this is only a small section of my thesis, you know, Philippi was just, you know, one of the cities that still supplied the empire with soldiers, so it was very hierarchical. That makes sense. Is that saying time? Is it? No, so yes, you're right. Even the military is still very hierarchical today and patriarchal as well. And so I dare say SIT would sit easily in that. But that's what I've seen in social ability theory. That's the route it's going at the moment.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Damian.